The year is 2008. Fire Emblem discussions are coming online and expanding, with players making posts about favorite classes and units. What started as a poll asking if players enjoy using Nino has now become a 15-page thread about how Nino is bad because she isn't worth training. Except she is worth it for a perfect rank run, and she kills everything after being trained. Still, training her is too much to ask, and she's a complete waste of the precious Aphis drops. In the end, no conclusion is reached, and Nino haters and lovers must resolve that the other side will never understand. 15 years later, surely discussions have improved, right? Right? Great. In this video, I would like to address discussions of gameplay and strategy in the Fire Emblem community. Whether players intended it or not, certain methods of demonstrating skill have been unfairly elevated above others, and many players have been denied from having their contributions taken seriously as a result. Even among players who consider themselves to play in the standardized method, countless heated debates have been sparked over the years, which have always led to more hurt than thought-provoking conclusions. To demonstrate this, I'd first like to contextualize the terms that I will be using, such as skill and efficiency. I'll then give a brief summary of how efficiency has been viewed within the community over the past 15 years. From there, I'll analyze the results of my survey on perceptions of efficiency, give some real, current examples of the impacts efficiency has had, and conclude with my recommendations for how we as a community can become a more agreeable, inclusive space for all players who enjoy Fire Emblem and its strategic greatness. The terms that I would like to contextualize are skill, efficiency, objective, and my own term, Golden Run. Let's start with skill. As a popular strategy RPG, it is understandable that Fire Emblem fans would want to discuss their strategies. More broadly speaking, it is also understandable that as a video game, players would want to express their proficiency and skill to prove their experience. The question stands though, how do you determine proficiency and skill in a game such as Fire Emblem? As a single-player game, there isn't inherently anyone else to beat, and the only way that the game measures winning is, well, completing the game. Past this base level of completion, players must impose their own challenges that push them to become even more familiar with the game's mechanics and available strategies. It is through this lens that I define player skill in Fire Emblem, giving yourself a goal and being able to perform it under any restrictions you laid out for yourself. If the goal is to just complete the game, you are skilled at beating the game. Some more restrictive goals that have become well known are the LTC and speedrun. For LTC, the goal is to get the lowest turn count possible throughout the course of the game, and you are considered skilled if you achieve comparatively lower turns, demonstrating the game knowledge required to come up with strategies that allow the player to achieve the victory condition in as few turns as possible. For speedrunning, the goal is to spend the absolute least amount of real-life time as possible, and you are considered skilled for achieving comparatively lower time, demonstrating both technical skill and the ability to create strategies that limit real-life time spent. The strengths of these goals is that they have a clear metric to measure success. How many turns or minutes did you take to beat the game, and is that greater or less than what other players accomplished? It should be emphasized, though, that the conclusion of whether a player demonstrates skill based on these metrics only applies if they have the same goal in mind. This is further complicated by the infinite amount of restrictions or rule sets players can apply to create a distinct goal, such as an LTC with 0% growths. Another way in which players might make completing the game more challenging is through various restrictions, such as only using one type of class, routing every map, achieving every side objective, or training units to max their stats. The game knowledge and strategies to complete the game under these conditions varies. A major difference for these types of challenges is that there is no given metric for determining success other than completing the game, and while they still express skill in accomplishing them, there is no way to say that you completed a Malignite solo run better than another. Also, while you could argue that certain goals require more game knowledge to complete than others, most goals actually require similar amounts of game knowledge, just in different areas, so it's more difficult than you might think to label one goal or playstyle as demonstrating more skill than another. But of course, this hasn't stopped players from trying. Efficiency is a term that has been given various meanings over the years, but it is generally agreed upon to mean playing fast. The three general categories I have observed players to have for this term are turns efficiency, real-time efficiency, and reliable LTC. In turns and real-time efficiency, the goal is just to beat the game, but you're putting yourself in the mindset of generally limiting either turn counts or real-life time spent. You're not trying to be the best, but just generally be proactive in achieving the victory condition, while having more reliability than strict LTCs or speedruns might. Reliable LTCs are like turns efficiency, but they are actively attempting to get the best results. The conception of efficiency that I would like to call out as the standard for gameplay discussions is reliable LTC. This adds challenge by asking the player not just to complete the game, but come up with strategies that minimize turn counts, while still encouraging the player to be thoughtful when it comes to putting together strategies with high odds of success. This seems fitting to some players as the standard for a good Fire Emblem gameplay for a few reasons. Games have implicit challenges that require players to be mindful of their turn count, such as brigands that will burn down the village after a set amount of turns. Games also display turn counts at the end of playthroughs, and many of the modern games go a step further, displaying turn counts at the end of each chapter, making players conscious of their turn counts. Certain games also have a ranking system that incorporates low turn counts, or award more bonus XP for beating the map under a certain amount of turns. I'll emphasize, though, that the player rarely needs to limit their turn counts to complete the game, with there only being a handful of required chapters in the series that have a timed victory condition. Also, the pace at which you play the game to achieve side objectives, and the pace that reliable LTC requires you to play, are completely different. I agree that caring about turn counts is a way to demonstrate skill and an understanding of the game's mechanics. However, it's completely up to the player as to which ways they would like to add challenge past just beating the game, and one method should not be valued higher than the other. As I'll demonstrate though, this has not been the case, with efficiency becoming the standard for gameplay discussions. This has not only left players that express skill excluded from the community or otherwise forced to downplay their skill, but has also led to heated debates as a result of efficiency being an inconsistent metric for supposedly objective comparisons. Generally, the most popular forms of gameplay discussions are explicitly making comparisons, or just otherwise discussing what the best options are, such as with tier lists, or discussing what a unit's best class in Fates is. Now, let's take a moment to consider how objective these comparisons can truly be. One style would be statistical comparisons, such as who has the highest speed growth. These are uncontroversial comparisons, as saying a unit has better speed growth is pretty well understood to mean statistically higher, but they also don't make for an interesting discussion. Another style would be making comparisons under the context of a specific playthrough, either in reviewing how units performed in an already completed run, or in speculating how much strategies contribute to a run attempting to be the best under a certain metric. Now, even for LTC tier lists, there's some uncertainty in placements, but the idea is that there's a specific metric to measure how a strategy relates to another. In both cases, it's pretty clear that the conclusions of which strategies are better or worse would not apply to other playthroughs with different playstyles and goals. As such, many players have turned to a vague efficiency as a metric that will allow for objective value judgments across many playthroughs. To be clear, this is different from guides, which shouldn't strictly give value judgments to strategies, units, classes, etc., but rather make categories that also take into consideration ease of use for the sake of new players who want advice on how to more easily beat the game, not taking into consideration the various challenges that players may impose on themselves. So, while it's pretty clear that any given context for making comparisons can't be used to make value judgments across other contexts, what about making comparisons within the context of efficiency itself? Well, I'll again point out that everyone has their own interpretation of the term, and no matter how many rules you may establish, the context for every efficiency playthrough will always be different, unless you establish that you are going for the best results under a certain metric. Many discussions do attempt to declare the context of what strategy is the most efficient, but from my observations, there is never a clear metric to determine what the best results even are. Rather, I would like to present my interpretation of what players have in mind when trying to have objective efficiency discussions, the Golden Efficiency Run, or Golden Run. To me, the Golden Run is one player's ideal playthrough, which achieves the lowest turn counts in such a manner that they believe to be fitting under the concept of efficiency. In the Golden Run, players assume certain strategies and units to be used and given all the investment because, in their mind, they will achieve the best results, and every other strategy is pushed aside as inferior. The issue with making conclusions and value judgments under one player's ideal Golden Efficiency Run is that despite assuming the best results, there is no actual metric for measurement. So not only can you not apply the conclusions to contexts not attempting to be efficient, you can't even apply them to playthroughs trying to be the most efficient. Regardless, players still bring their own ideas of what's best at gameplay discussions, resulting in debates that essentially boil down to players arguing why their playstyle and the choices they made are better. This is unproductive, and leads to players with a non-standard conception of efficiency being hurt when they are told their analysis is wrong, when in reality all players are equally wrong for trying to make comparisons and value judgments that span different playstyles. I'll start by saying that I am not a veteran of the series, and I cannot personally speak to how the community felt or was perceived in the instances that I'm going to reference. What I can do, however, is give an outside perspective on the topics, without being emotionally attached to any one side or interpretation. I actually did quite a lot of research, so to keep my thoughts concise, I'll just give my key takeaways. If you would like to see my full write-up, I'll link the Google Doc in the description. For my observations, debates on what standard should be set for gameplay discussions go as far back as 2008. Though Serena's Forest appears to have started with serene discussions about favorite characters and the like, it didn't take long for me to discover some contentious threads, including one heated argument over whether snipers are objectively bad, with defenses essentially built around how Sniper does or does not fit in with their personal playstyle. Believing that discussions would be fruitless if some standard was not established, some posts presented what they considered the standard, with conditions that reflect those seen today. Hardest mode available, considering average growths rather than personal experience, and most importantly, getting low turn counts with reliability. Certain rules were specified to describe low turn counts, such as no grinding or boss abuse, but I'll note that I never found any posts expressing that players are assumed to get the lowest turn counts, and a metric for measuring what would be considered a reliable clear was never detailed. Nonetheless, an attempt was made to establish a standard for objective comparisons, resulting in value judgments that would span different playstyles, most often geared around comparing units, and I observed a fierce pushback against such attempts. Many players expressed frustration with subjective analysis being pushed as the truth, taking the form of, strongly worded comments. These comments were mostly brushed aside due to their aggression, but that isn't to say the pushback was stopped. I've observed several instances of players questioning efficiency as the standard. Many players have expressed a concern with such a vague term being used to contextualize supposedly objective discussions, and suggested that the term be specified to avoid confusion and allow for more fair comparisons. Each time, though, these critiques have been written off, with the common counter-argument being that few players explicitly argue for their playstyle to be assumed to be the best or the standard for all gameplay discussions. However, the pushing of one playstyle as the standard is always implied from statements, and while it may seem like players critiquing one playstyle being used as a standard are over-aggressive, this shouldn't invalidate their actual critiques, and we shouldn't just dismiss these players. After all, they are reflective of the frustration that real people feel when it is implied that their playstyle is not considered in the standard for gameplay discussions being presented. I'll point out one specific attempt from over 3 years ago meant to give a precise metric for comparing the efficiency of strategies, expected turn count, or ETC. The theory behind it is pretty well thought out, but also complex, so if you want to get a full grasp on that topic, I'll link the original video in the description. From my understanding, ETC can be used to calculate the expected turns for a clear, taking into account the final displayed turn count and every non-guaranteed action. Strategies are given a numerical value to judge their performance under the ETC calculations, and this number can be directly compared to that of other strategies. As a context for gameplay discussions, and more specifically comparisons, this is a solid idea, and I have a great amount of respect for the creator for spending the time to create such detailed calculations. Of course, there's the issue of the complexity of the calculations, especially when applied to games with rewind features or RNG elements outside of combat. This is at least a theoretically accurate way to determine a best run that values both turn counts and reliability, but I observed that it was ultimately dismissed by the community as a whole, and gameplay discussions have continued to use vague metrics while attempting to make objective comparisons. As my final takeaway from my research, I'd like to point out how efficiency has been conceptualized as superior gameplay over the years. I can't pinpoint an exact post that made the transition, but I got the impression that for the beginning of efficiency's place in the community as a recognized term, it was just generally assumed to be the context for gameplay discussions, and if you had a different view on the performance of a class, unit, etc., it would see great pushback in the most popular gameplay discussions. I can notice that for at least 4 years now, though, players have explicitly started referring to efficiency as high-level gameplay, inherently giving a higher value to this playstyle over others. Many players have correctly pointed out that you can play the game however you like, but face any critique of this view being unfairly elevated, with comments such as, "You can play how you want," or "This is just for fun, don't get mad." This is hardly a new sentiment, but these comments now reflect a desire to keep efficiency as the standard for gameplay considered good, with other playstyles being relegated as just for fun, and not representative of truly skilled gameplay. Any value judgments made using these other playstyles are disregarded, or even mocked, even if they aren't trying to apply them to a certain efficient context, while value judgments are accepted to be universally true if you fit them under the arbitrary standard for skilled gameplay. But now, how many players are really coming to gameplay discussions with non-standard conceptions of efficiency anyways? To get a better sense for this, let's take a look at my community survey on efficiency. A couple weeks ago, I created a thread asking for players' personal definition for the term. Using their responses from that thread, I created a survey that asked players to weigh in on the most common topics. I posted the survey on Reddit, Serenist Forest, GameFAQs, and my personal YouTube and Twitter accounts. Most questions were phrased as a statement, which players would respond with how much they agreed or disagreed. I also included a checkbox for players to indicate which specific rules and restrictions, if any, they would assume in an efficient setting. Finally, I left a space for players to elaborate on their votes and give any hot takes or final thoughts on the subject. Within the first 48 hours, there were 332 responses, with an additional 43 in the following 2 weeks, for 375 total. I cannot say exactly how many players these online communities consist of, but I think it's fair to say that 375 responses isn't exactly enough to accurately represent the entire community. I might speculate that it's at least representative of the active community, and that it demonstrates some general trends, but take all the quantitative data with a grain of salt. A strong takeaway, however, is the qualitative responses at the end, which express real opinions and emotions from active community members, and they should absolutely be considered in our discussion. But first, let's review the specific questions and their responses. First, I asked a few demographic-like questions to get a sense of which types of players are being represented. For how hardcore of a Fire Emblem gamer are you, the majority of players lean towards hardcore over casual, with 40% out of 4 and 35% out of 3. The majority of players had both heard of efficiency and had an idea of what it means and how it is applied, at 85%. 9% had heard of the term but not what it means, and 6% had just never heard of the term. As for which community players found the survey from, the majority responded with Reddit, at 79%, but I'll point out that this doesn't necessarily mean that players are only coming from Reddit, as it's possible Reddit was just the first place players found it. In any future survey, I'll be sure to more clearly ask which communities players are a part of, but for now, we can acknowledge that the majority of players are involved in Reddit, with at least some representation of Serenist Forest at 6%, GameFAQs at 12%, and a few voters coming from various other spaces. The first statement in the agree or disagree section was efficiency implies actively seeking lower turn counts. The majority of players agreed on this one, with 43% agreeing and 32% strongly agreeing. Keep in mind, though, that 14% were neutral and 11% disagreed to some extent, so players weren't exactly unanimous in this. The next statement was efficiency implies taking less real-life time to complete the game. While real-time efficiency may not be the standard, the results show that players are more divided on the subject than one might think, with around 44% on the disagree end, 38% agreeing, and 18% being neutral. Even when looking at how casual and hardcore gamers voted, the results are still pretty evenly split. Next up is efficiency implies only using the best units. My intention was for players to use their own interpretation of the term best when responding to this statement. I'll admit that this was not made explicitly clear, and that the results may be a bit blurred as a result. Players were generally split, but the results skew towards agreeing at 28%, with 18% strongly agreeing, but keep in mind that 33% either disagreed or strongly disagreed. Players were a lot less split, though, on units that take less investment are more efficient, with 39% agreeing and 43% strongly agreeing. Still not a unanimous vote, but keep in mind that the statement didn't include any value judgments like good or best, and was essentially asking if players consider investment to be relevant in their definition of efficiency, specifically when it comes to units. The next statement was taking a couple extra turns to catch a unit up would be unacceptable in an efficient playthrough. In this statement, a strategy is presented, that of spending turns to train a unit, and the value judgment of being unacceptable is given to that strategy under the context of the player's interpretation of efficiency. The results of the statement are also blurred, as many players clarified that would be acceptable, but only if the unit made up for it later, by saving turns or making the game easier. We can observe a general trend towards disagreeing, but the phrasing of the question makes it difficult to discern the context in which players would find the strategy to be acceptable. Next, I'll skip to the statement, efficiency is a very specific playstyle. This one was also pretty vague, but the intention was to see if players had a specific idea of efficiency in mind, or if they felt it encompassed many different playstyles. Again, I won't read too much into the results of the statement, but we can observe that the results are skewed towards strongly agreeing, but still featured 19% at neutral, and 25% disagreeing. Perhaps the most overtly relevant to our discussion is the statement, playing efficiently demonstrates skill in playing Fire Emblem. I'll repeat that I do not wish to downplay the skill of any player, including those who consider themselves to play efficiently. The most common response was agreeing, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Only 51% of players are on the side of agreeing, leaving 22% neutral and 27% that are on the side of disagreeing. This shows that there is indeed a substantial portion of the community that does not view efficiency as demonstrating skill, or that it does, but it shouldn't overshadow the skill expressed in other playstyles. The last two statements were testing how much players enjoyed playing under their interpretation of efficiency, and how much they enjoyed discussions under such a context. In both instances, the results were rounded around neutral, with about an equal amount of players agreeing and disagreeing. Specifically, for playing, 31% were neutral, 34% agreed, and 35% disagreed. For discussing, it leaned a little more towards agreeing, with 43%, with 23% being neutral and 34% disagreeing. This is interesting, because it tells us that, as a whole, respondents did not actually lean strongly towards enjoying either playing or discussing the subject matter. When comparing the responses to each other, though, we can observe a positive correlation between enjoying playing efficiently and discussing it. Keep in mind that it's still not unanimous, and we shouldn't gear gameplay discussions about efficiency to only be accessible to those who enjoy playing efficiently. I would like to go back to playing efficiently demonstrates skill in playing Fire Emblem. This statement had a pretty clear trend towards agreeing, but we can see yet another positive correlation in comparing the demonstration of skill through playing efficiently and the enjoyment of playing efficiently. This brings us back to the point that players wish to have their experience in video games validated and to be credited for their accomplishments. I think this breakdown demonstrates this point, and I will again argue that all players should be more open-minded when it comes to viewing the skill demonstrated in other playthroughs. The difference is not as simple as efficiency is high-level gameplay, and anything else is just for fun. Moving past the agree or disagree statements, let's take a quick look at the rule set checkbox. Here, players were given a list of specific rules or restrictions that I have observed to be included as the context for efficient gameplay discussions. As the results show, no rule is even assumed by over 50% of players, and as many comments clarified, these are additional restrictions that players need to specify to be the context of gameplay discussions. So, to review, what are the biggest takeaways from these quantitative responses? Well, they're a little unclear from the limited amount of responses and some terms being up to the player's interpretation. We can at least observe some general trends amongst a select amount of active community members, such as the perception of skill being correlated to the enjoyment of the playstyle, and that most of these statements aren't nearly agreed upon as some might think. Now, I would like to take the following free responses from the survey, paired with some recent posts and stories I've observed within the community, to demonstrate how the various concepts I've discussed apply to our current community, and evidence how real people are still being impacted by community standards and behavior within gameplay discussions. While we can observe and analyze the various interpretations of efficiency that have been discussed throughout the years, what really matters is how players view efficiency today, and how these views on efficiency warp current gameplay discussions. In the beginning of the video, I presented the three most common styles of efficiency: the reliable LTC that directly compares turns while keeping high odds of success, turns efficiency, in which the player is simply in the mindset of limiting turn counts and avoiding behaviors like grinding, and real-time efficiency, in which the player is in the mindset of limiting time spent on completing chapters. I observed all of these styles to be present in the free responses at the end of my survey. I'll point out that most comments that fit under the description of reliable LTC through balancing the lowest turns with reliability all seem to be vibes only, and don't actually reference how this would be counted. As such, I'd actually like to point out my golden run concept as a common branch of the style, which doesn't have a way to compare strategies, but attempts to have an objective context for gameplay discussions regardless. The only alternative that I've observed for legitimately measuring attempts to have the lowest turn counts with acceptable reliability is ETC, but few players brought this up in their responses. Of course, I observed many players with the turns efficiency style being upfront with their conception of efficiency relating to turn counts, but not specifically measuring them. Rather, many players have expressed efficiency as more of a mindset, or being on a spectrum, in which behaviors that heavily extend turn counts are discouraged, and those that push towards achieving the victory condition sooner are encouraged, at the player's discretion. Time efficiency was also not uncommon, valuing the ease of use of strategies. Some players were very outspoken about time efficiency not being efficiency, and that we should assume players spend large amount of time coming up with their strategies. Whether or not you agree with this, it stands true that there are real people who use the term in this time efficiency sense, and we can't just write this conception off as invalid. If you don't wish for ease of use to be relevant in a discussion, it must be specifically stated, as to not give the wrong impression. Now, I've observed a few different interpretations of efficiency that these styles don't cover. Some players think of efficiency as basically LTC, basically speedrunning, or a no resetting Iron Man run. I don't wish to blame anyone for having these interpretations, but I would like to make some clarifications as to avoid any misconceptions. LTC distinguishes itself from reliable LTC through, well, not needing to be as reliable, and turns efficiency because it has a specific metric for measuring success rather than being a mindset. Speedrunning is distinct from real-time efficiency because, again, it has a specific metric for measuring success rather than being a mindset, and takes into account many aspects such as animation mitigation and technical skill for fast inputs. I've seen arguments that efficiency is like an Iron Man run, taking the reliable parts to mean that clears should mitigate the need for resets entirely. I see the reasoning, but I still think that to avoid miscommunications, Iron Man runs should be a distinct playstyle, as having a mindset for low turns or less real-life time spent does not strictly mean players will never reset. Within all these playstyles, which do active community members see as demonstrating skill, and therefore acceptable in gameplay discussions? I'll once again point out that some players actively state efficiency as high-level play, and many more discuss efficiency in such a way that supports it as the standard for objective gameplay discussions. For these comments, I get the impression that they mean to refer to efficiency as reliable LTC, but actually mean the nebulous golden run that uses their personal playstyle as a metric for success, rather than anything calculated. On the other hand, I observed many players directly expressing non-standard, unmeasured styles of play as efficient, and/or a method of demonstrating skill. So, where does this fit in with gameplay discussions? Ideally, everyone would be able to contribute their thoughts and ideas on the gameplay, but we can see that this has not been the case. In fact, many players directly, intentionally or not, encourage a certain view of efficiency as the standard, therefore not leaving room for other views of efficiency and other playstyles entirely. As I explained before, there are few players blatantly expressing this, but we need to remember that our words and actions can have implications past what is directly said. As a demonstration of this, I've observed many responses that reflect those of the past, in which efficiency haters are framed as angry that their playstyle isn't the standard, upset that they're being told they're bad, or the real annoying players. Now, if we take a look at some actual responses from these supposed efficiency haters, we can see that there are many calm, simple critiques against efficiency as the standard. It appears to me that a lot of the frustration from both sides is rooted in miscommunication, but also some bias in the aforementioned concept of players wanting to be right and have their experience validated. I think the overarching issue is that objective gameplay discussion cannot occur outside playthroughs with clear metrics for measuring success, but players wish to make comparisons regardless. With efficiency pushed as the standard, players think that a baseline has been established, but end up just talking past each other. Meanwhile, some players don't even wish to have objective gameplay discussions under a certain interpretation of efficiency, but they get dismissed as just playing for fun, or using meme builds. I demonstrated how attempts at objective gameplay discussions have overshadowed discussions that don't wish to use the same metrics of lowest turn counts, high reliability, going as far back as 15 years ago. This behavior resulting from efficiency as standard is still relevant today though, and you don't even need to look far back, with it being present in most every attempt at gameplay discussions in the community. Specifically, players will often interject their thoughts on a unit or strategy with a general good or bad value judgments. In a discussion about their performance in the reliable LTC run, this may be supposed to mean resource inefficient or doesn't save turns compared to other similar units. Just saying X unit is bad, don't use them, assumes that the other player is playing in that reliable LTC context, or at least attempting a vague golden efficiency run, but again, we have to consider what our words might imply. Just saying good or bad may make some players think they can't perform well, or would not have any place in the more general turns efficiency setting. I've also observed that if players do employ certain strategies or units that aren't considered good in the golden efficiency run, they have to downplay their skill, and say, haha, I know it's not good, but I did this, when in reality it was just as much of a demonstration of skill, and could still be included in the loose definition of efficiency, as they weren't going for a reliable LTC in the first place. While players interjecting value judgments in other contexts is hardly uncommon, I'll go ahead and point out a few recent examples. A very common one is calling units of the villager archetype bad, oftentimes with strong wording. This one is especially concerning to me, because any player that attempts to defend their performance is always met with harsh criticism, despite not having clear metrics that would legitimately deny the units of a training arc. I specifically observed a recent thread about Donald that painted using him as the incorrect answer, when the original poster never even specified reliable LTC or turns efficiency to be the goal. As for classes, I observed a thread pointing out best classes being a myth, with comments quick to defend Wyvern Lord as the best class, without even discussing under what metric it's supposedly best in. On a similar note, I saw a post simply showing Ivy in the Mage Knight class, saying that the class change worked for them, and asking what players use Ivy in. Of course, some comments were quick to interject that, well actually, Lindworm is Ivy's best class, when that wasn't even the prompt, and discredits the contributions of the original poster. As another example of comparisons being assumed to be made under reliable LTC standards, I'll point out a post that I made, which essentially showed a tier list made from the average of how I judged each unit to perform in my playthroughs. I labeled it as personal experience, and didn't say who's best or worst. It ended up not getting a lot of traction, and the couple people that did respond seemed convinced I was trying to make objective value judgments on the units in a reliable LTC setting. It took a tedious back and forth for the other person to finally understand the concept of ranking units without trying to make objective statements about their performance. Another contentious issue was when I tried to give my input on unit placements in an engaged tier list, in which it seemed players were assuming a golden efficiency run, despite that not being made clear in the description at all. I'll give credit to the posts for having more descriptions about the context of the run than many tier lists do, but I still believed my arguments for my atypical placements to be valid, and always asked for players to give a counter-argument if they felt differently. A couple other voters had similarly contrary views, one of whom expressed their concerns directly with the poster about how the terms weren't clear, but this didn't go well for us, and most of the regular voters took it upon themselves to disregard attempts for a genuine discussion, and talk about how anyone who voted differently was ridiculous and just didn't get it in the public subreddit Discord. From what I've heard, being name-dropped and really talked about in the Discord behind one's back isn't an uncommon experience, and though I recognize that not everyone is involved, I think it reflects very poorly on the community and makes for a space that should be about having engaging discussions, more exclusive than inclusive. I'd like to conclude this section by pointing out a couple posts and stories that demonstrate how efficiency as the standard has led towards players feeling excluded from the gameplay side of the community, or just otherwise feel they aren't as skilled as they actually are. For starters, there was a post about common knowledge that players ignore, which got a lot of traction a couple weeks ago. Now, there were many comments that specified that you could play the game however you wanted, and that most common knowledge was advice for new players that got twisted into the standard. But I'll emphasize that second part. While not necessarily intentional, a standard was established within the community, and now there is a large amount of people who feel they have to preface their strategies and playthroughs with, I know it's not good, but... The sentiment is hardly uncommon, and I find it rather unfortunate that there are many players who don't need help beating the game and deploy strategies that demonstrate skill, but have to downplay themselves as just having fun or doing unoptimal strategies, just because they don't fit in with someone else's ideal golden efficiency run. Another recent, more specific example I observed was a post about a player's experience with their first Three Houses playthrough. They explained their strategies, which were effective for the bulk of the game, but when they looked at Reddit posts to get advice on the last couple chapters, they got the impression that their strategies, which didn't involve making every unit a Wyvern Lord, were wrong, and they then expressed a concern based on this information that they would not be able to complete the Silver Snow route without essentially submitting to the standard Wyvern spam strategies. Again, I think it's very unfortunate that the current standards are making players doubt the validity of their strategies, and I think it would be very irresponsible to continue gameplay discussions the way they are currently held without considering the implications that they may have. coming from my survey, I got a comment that pointed out how current gameplay discussions focused around tier lists have way too rigid of a grading system, and that this makes them implicitly exclusive for the majority of players who want to take part in gameplay discussions, including players who have plenty of experience with the games, but just don't engage with it in a very specific way. They pointed out an engaged tier list of their own that had very in-depth explanations for their placements, but got completely disregarded for not matching the popular standards of efficiency, and apparently having outlandish rankings. Considering the length of the post and its clear expression of skill and game knowledge, I'm incredibly disappointed that it had such a poor reception. Lastly, I received a thorough write-up from a survey respondent explaining their frustrating history with the community. In it, they talked about how they are someone who should feel right at home in efficiency discussions, as someone with a lot of experience with the game's systems, and who enjoys finding ways to make the most of their turns. However, they don't enjoy the current standards for efficiency, in which warp skipping, being able to hit one-round KO benchmarks, and only using the best units is assumed. They find frustration with the players who push this as the standard, pointing out how no one has ever directly said efficiency is the best, but that the superiority of one conception of efficiency is heavily implied from their behavior. They specifically point out the common knowledge thread, stating that these are mindsets that were once commonplace and accepted before players made their view on efficiency the standard. Now, there are many strategies that get downplayed as silly or unoptimal, and regardless of whether this came to be from players trying to improve overall player skill, it's still an issue. They conclude by discussing how gameplay discussions and tier lists used to be good resources, as new players will end up looking to them for advice, whether they were intended for that or not, but the only respectable gameplay tier lists focus around the standard efficiency. In doing so, gameplay discussions are sending the wrong message to new players and pushing one playstyle as superior for experienced players. I think the story perfectly encapsulates the issues with the current state of gameplay discussions within the community. There are a lot of players who come here to engage in conversations and talk about their strategies, but the dominant standard for what's considered strategic is very strict and specific, and players are discouraged from participating if their own ideas don't match those of players who are in the know, who can't even explain the context for their discussions themselves. To review, the goals of gameplay discussions within the community are providing a place for players to express their experience, gain knowledge, and skill with other players who also enjoy the game, opening up views on which strategies players can deploy to achieve a certain goal, and presenting thought experiments where players are driven to further deepen their game knowledge to come to conclusions. The issues that I've observed to exist in gameplay discussions within the Fire Emblem community are players downplaying their skill, heated and frustrating debates with no proper resolution, and players feeling excluded. Based on my research into the community's history of gameplay discussions and the results of my survey, I would argue that the causes of these issues are making comparisons and value judgments within one context and applying them to other contexts, running or contributing to gameplay discussions assuming one context but not making it clear, and referencing one playstyle as a metric for good gameplay. So, where do we go from here? My main recommendations are use clear language that conveys exactly what you mean to say, restrict comparisons and value judgments to very specific contexts, and open up new avenues for gameplay discussions to allow for more players to participate. Using more clear language may not seem like the biggest deal at first glance, but as we've seen over the years, certain unfair standards have been set because of the way in which gameplay discussions have been talked about. Similarly, a lot of contentious debates are rooted in players not clearly describing what they are discussing, or what meaning of efficiency they are even trying to use as the context. As an example, if you wish to give advice on which strategies or units a new player should use, your argument should be contextualized around ease of use, rather than using the value judgment of X unit is bad, don't use them, which came from a context comparing resource efficiency or contributions in a reliable LTC run. I'll highlight one player's explanation of efficiency when it comes to playstyles and a metric for ranking units. From my understanding, they explain efficiency through an input and output model in which you're trying to maximize the output while minimizing the input. The output of Fire Emblem is generally just completing the game, with LTC playthroughs having an input of turns. For efficiency in units, the output is their performance, and their input is the resources they use. If players explain how a strategy or unit is more efficient under this model, it wouldn't be contentious because it's clearly explaining what is being ranked, and accurate arguments can be made to demonstrate how one strategy has a greater input and is therefore less efficient. This is not the case though, as many players present a unit needing resources to perform well as strictly bad, rather than actually addressing the intention of the analysis. In doing so, players end up interpreting bad as something else entirely, with a heated debate resulting from this lack of clarity. If we wish to make comparisons, the specific context to which it is being applied must be made very, very clear. For example, this is a unit ranking for playthroughs attempting to get the lowest turn counts with X level of reliability. In this instance, you also need to clarify what level of reliability clears need to have. Alternatively, you could defer to ETC calculations, showing how using one unit in a certain strategy increases or decreases the expected turn count. If anyone has another idea for how to measure what level of reliability would be acceptable, then that could work too. As my survey demonstrated, players are actually pretty agreeable when the terms of comparisons are clear. If we wish to continue gameplay discussions about strategies, units, etc. under the more vague context of a mindset like turns efficiency or real-time efficiency, then I think we need to consider more formats for discussion other than comparisons. In theory, discussions that don't assume one specific playthrough should open up new avenues of approaching the game, not try to find which would be the best under some arbitrary, vague metric that players aren't even trying to follow. As I referenced before, unit guides is one such style of analysis, going beyond reading statistics and giving well-reasoned suggestions and categories for which units have a higher ease of use, or reference what levels of investment units would need to perform well in a playthrough just attempting to beat the game. Another format I would like to highlight and expand upon is the team review. In this format, players show off their teams after completing a playthrough, sometimes doing so in the form of an isolated tier list, but I think players could go even further. What was the process like getting the units to where they are now? What were some specific moments where they were particularly effective in achieving the player's goals? What are some potential improvements for having even higher performance? Etc. This fulfills the desire for players to express their experience, as well as introducing strategies that other players may have not considered before. There is clearly an interest in analyzing units, so I would also recommend new formats that focus on analyzing units in isolation. This would avoid the instinct to label units as good and bad, or better and worse, while still speaking to how units can perform in various playthroughs. I think a concern with current unit reviews is that some come off as reading off information from a wiki, which doesn't fulfill the desires for players who already have that game knowledge and wish to come to interesting conclusions from that knowledge. I know that tier lists are a popular and easy format, but I think there's a lot of creativity to be had in coming up with new formats. One idea I would like to present is charting out the various builds and levels of performance that a unit can reach with varying levels of investment. In this format, players could use both basic wiki knowledge and their knowledge of various benchmarks that a unit needs to reach certain levels of performance on average. Now you could go further and rank the builds based on how much you value them in your playstyle, but the point of the list wouldn't be to come to any objective conclusion about which units are better or worse for requiring certain levels of investment, or which builds are better for needing less investment. This is simply a way to utilize game knowledge to make the comparison of how many resources does this unit need to perform various builds. This both fulfills the desire for players to have thought experiments about unit statistics, and results in a chart that isn't spreading misinformation about unit quality. In fact, players with different playstyles can look at this chart and take away relevant information, pinpointing which build would be most applicable to their playstyle and seeing how to achieve it. Of course, this unit performance chart is just one of many possibilities for analyzing units without making comparisons, and I would be super interested to hear what other ideas players have. I would encourage everyone to keep an open mind when it comes to new styles of gameplay discussions, and if nothing else, remember to use clear wording in the future. I'll conclude with perhaps my favorite response from the entire survey. Talking about efficiency in Fire Emblem has been one of the most inefficient topics of discussion in the Fire Emblem community. While funny, this statement also has some truth to it. Discussions about efficiency have been going on for most of the community's history, with no progress ever being made, and I genuinely think that a lot of the negative impacts could have been mitigated if players just acted a little differently. Using clear language and trying to have objective comparisons and discussions, keeping value judgments restricted to the context they were applied to, and taking a moment to understand where other players are coming from would all go a long way in improving the community. I might not be able to change the attitude of the entire space myself, but I think if we all consider these attitudes when contributing to the community as a collective, we could make a genuine impact. If you would like to see me make a full video on a team review, unit performance chart, or your own idea for interesting gameplay analysis, let me know. My current schedule includes monthly installments of my Sync Marathon series, where I play all the mainline titles synchronously, as well as weekly short-form content with a variety of fun topics, and I'd be happy to include some gameplay analysis in these weekly videos. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep up with my future uploads, consider leaving a like and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.